What up, everybody? It's your boy Kentario, and I'm back again for another episode of Christ and Comics. And today we're going to be doing this video on the series of Loki, which is on Disney Plus, and it's a continuation of the MCU. One of the main things that we are looking to do is to primarily address what a Christian can or cannot take away from this series. As we go to discuss this series, let me give you a brief summary of what we're getting into. You see, the show takes place not after Endgame, but it takes place at a different point in the timeline of the series. So, as those that have watched Endgame know, the team of the Avengers had to go back in time to different points in history to get their hands on the Infinity Stones. That way they would be able to bring everybody back whose lives were lost. In the midst of going to get the Cosmic Cube to get one of the stones, they ended up dropping a Cosmic Cube, and Loki got his hands on it and he disappeared with it in their possession. They were able to compensate for that by going farther back in time. However, with Loki disappearing with the Cosmic Cube, it caused a branch of the timeline. The issue with that is, there is an organization known as the Time Variance Authority, aka the TVA, under the orders of the Timekeepers, who are responsible for keeping the continuity of the timeline. Now, when the question comes up as to what the Avengers were doing with that, the Avengers were fulfilling the expectations of the timeline, even though they went back in time and changed things, especially since they corrected for what they did in the timeline. Now, being that Loki has done so, causing this branch, they had to go back to that point in time, reset that portion of the timeline, and take Loki into custody. At this point, with Loki being taken into custody, he has now been given the revelation that he is responsible for doing what he is supposed to do, which is be that mischievous and criminal character to go and then work towards a certain level of redemption, and at the end die. This has now impacted the character of Loki having a purpose in his life. Now, what can we expect from this series? I highly recommend that you go watch it. Mainly because if you haven't watched it, this video will be containing spoilers as to what took place throughout the series and some of the connections between what took place in the series to Marvel Comics, and even more so a Christian's perspective on the series. Just to give everybody an outline as to what they're going to be seeing in this video, we're first going to be reviewing the character of Loki, not only from the standpoint of the MCU, but we will be looking at the Norse mythology, we will be looking at Marvel Comics, as well as the MCU. The same goes for the Time Variance Authority, where we'll be looking at their Marvel Comics perspective and then be getting into their application into the MCU. We will also be touching on a character known as He Who Remains and his application from Marvel Comics as well as the MCU. And we will be ending this video off, of course, going into the depths of some hidden messages that you can find within this series, as well as hitting on that Christian perspective, which I hope that's the reason you all came. Let me just give everybody this reminder that if you like what is being produced on this channel, please go hit that subscribe button as well as that little notification bell. That way you all can get notices of when new videos are being posted. Also, if you like what's being said in this video, once you watch it in fullness, please hit that like button, as well as if you have any comments, feedback that you'd like to leave with me, please leave that in the comment section for me, please. I definitely welcome any and all feedback. Now, let's get into this video. So let's start out with Loki and give some background on this guy. So as far as the Norse mythology goes, he really just kind of lives up to that main expectation of being that trickster. But let's give this character a little bit more of a background. Now, where they introduce in Marvel Comics, where he comes from the Frost Titans, and then in their defeat, Odin has taken him under his wing, to clarify from the Norse mythology that he is the son of Forbochi, which is a Frost Titan, as well as the son of Laufey, who is believed to be an Asgardian goddess. So that also ties into that Asgardian relationship that Loki actually has with the Asgardians as well as something even deeper to speak to. Now, they're not biologically siblings. However, both Odin and Loki are the ones that are brothers, not Loki and Thor. What? So that's something that's different between the Norse mythology versus what we get in comic books, TV series, as well as the MCU. Just to make sure that we point that out. And with him having been that son, again, like I said, that gives him some rights into Asgard, which is why he's able to partake in drinks and do the mischievous things that he does, go to the aid of those in Asgard. That's where he has that deeper relationship. But he really lives up to that mischievous name that is under his belt. A couple of other things to acknowledge about Loki is that Loki can shapeshift. Now, when we say shapeshift, I'm not simply speaking of between male and female. He can shapeshift between male, female, animal, creature, items. He has all of those abilities under his belt. And that is something that in one sense causes him to be feared, but in another sense causes him to be completely hated throughout all of Norse mythology. Now, as to get deeper into that Norse mythology, not only will I be making sure that I leave a video for that mythology, I'll be also leaving videos in the description for any deeper recollections for Loki as far as Marvel Comics goes as well. That way y'all have that to refer to. I always touch bases with one known as Comics Explained here on YouTube. That way I'm able to kind of keep up to date with what's happening with comics, and I just love the way that he articulates what's actually happening in those particular comic books. He has a clear and consistent way of communicating that. So I highly recommend that you all check him out. Now let's talk about Loki from the perspective of Marvel Comics itself. Now, he was created by these three great creators, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and Larry Lieber. And in him having been created, he was created actually back in 1949 in a comic which was produced by Marvel, of course, which was Venus, Goddess of Love. Now, in this interpretation, it was actually completely different than any version that anyone has ever seen of Loki. In this interpretation, he was mostly just a powerful version of evil, not anyone that was necessarily mischievous. And even more so, like I said, with his appearance is completely different. So much so, I would dare say that he actually resembles Mephisto, which may speak to the person that replaced him as far as his character in this version of himself versus what we get in the future. Now, where his character began to change was in a volume known as Journey into Mystery, which came out in 1965. That's where we get the yellow helmet with the yellow horns and the green suit version of Loki, which ends up resulting in the same thing that we get in the MCU, where Loki causes trouble for Thor and the other heroes that we know of a part of the Avengers, thus resulting in them teaming up against him to defeat him. Same result as what we get in the MCU. He causes all of these heroes trouble, but it ends up causing them to team up rather than it leading to their downfall. Of course, to the downfall of Loki. Now, some aspects of comic book Loki that I want to make sure to point out. One thing that we don't see in the MCU is the level of physical power that he possesses, and to some extent the magical, but primarily the physical. He actually can go toe-to-toe as far as physical strength. With early versions of the Hulk, he could go toe-to-toe with Thor. He's a great hand-to-hand combatant, which is very lacking at some levels when we're looking at the version of him in the MCU. As well as his magical prowess is much higher in Marvel Comics versus what we see in the series as well. He does small tricks as to get away and to deceive and to ensure that he survives, or to show himself to have a certain level of strength, not the level of power in which we see in Marvel Comics. And some other things too, which this will kind of play into what we get in the MCU version of Loki, or at least in the series, is that Loki goes through reincarnation processes, because any Asgardian that dies ends up being reincarnated. So when Loki first died in Marvel Comics, he was reincarnated as Lady Loki. That's where we first get an introduction of the female Loki, not Sylvie as what we see in the show. Now, of course, as Lady Loki dies, that results in us getting Kid Loki. Now, I'm giving a very simplified way as to how this is pointing out without many of the details. Like I said, that video will be in the description if you want all the details. But that's how that played out, as it being a change in his form due to reincarnation, not necessarily as what we see in the MCU, where the timeline branches off, you get a different version of Loki from each of those different points in time, or different timelines in general. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about MCU Loki. Now, some things about MCU Loki is, which I find interesting, is with the way that they portrayed him there in the beginning as one that was in pursuit of power, but also that mixed with his pursuit of truth. Because in the first Thor movie, we see that Loki has set in place a plan to become king of Asgard, whereas he otherwise had no rights to the throne, being that he was an adopted son. In his pursuit of the truth of where he truly came from is when he learns that he's actually from the lineage of the Frost Titans. He was taken from Jotun, the land of Jotun, where he comes from, and made that adopted son after he defeated who in Marvel Comics was Loki, as I discussed earlier, where that was Forbochi, who was Loki's father. In Marvel Comics, they made Loki's father, the Frost Titan, the name of Loki, which actually was Loki's mother's name when it comes to the Norse mythology. So, with Loki in the MCU finding out this truth, you see this emotional breakdown that takes place with his character, being that he has been deceived this entire time, which increases the depth of his betrayal and his attempt to take the throne, being that he comes from an enemy of Odin in the first place. But where it's an issue of that upbringing, a lot of people take away from that the responsibility of the parents in the growth and the development of their children. How you treat your children will result in who they become in the future. There's a little bit of play on that. But at the same time, there is the play where the choice is still the child to make a different decision, regardless of how their parents treat them. So it's a very powerful, I guess you could say, dichotomy that's illustrated here throughout the MCU. So we have Loki going on this pursuit of power and losing, but continuing to pursue power as he partners with Thanos to get power. He then loses. But then he goes to partnering with Thor, almost to show himself to be from villain to an anti-hero, because he still contends with Thor, fights with Thor, and argues with Thor, but he is still working towards the greater good at the end. And even more so, as we go through what takes place in Thor Ragnarok all the way up into Infinity War, we see that Loki has a complete change in character, as he really, in this moment, after dying, I'd say 4 times in the past, faking his death, he finally actually dies when he contends with Thanos. He allows for himself to die in this moment. Now, as we see with Loki dying, how does that correlate to Loki, who's now been taken in by the TVA? The way that this correlates is, all of this has been shown to Loki to show him where his life was supposed to end up being like. And this impacts him because, in one sense, he's seeing what his purpose was supposed to be, which is, of course, to die. And that leading to Thor becoming that hero that they ended up needing, becoming the one that wields the World Breaker, contributes to the growth of the character of Thor. And, of course, even more so, that relationship. But what happens to Loki is Loki now has to question, well, what is my purpose now? Being that I don't live that out, and 2, what is my choice? But the thing about having that choice and knowing that the timekeepers have an expectation of how the timeline needs to go, that means they have an expectation of what Loki needs to do. Meaning Loki does not truly get to make his own decisions. He truly does not get to operate in free will. He truly is not free. So where he thinks the deception of Odin contributes to his downfall and to all the struggles that he has went through, he now learns that it's deeper than that. That is actually the timekeepers that contribute to that. And even more so, the death, the capture of several other versions of himself throughout this series. But a character by the name of Mobius gives Loki an opportunity to help him keep the timeline in order, because it seems as though there's a rogue Loki going about and we need to bring him down. But what decisions does Loki make throughout this series that would contribute to how this story ends? Alright, now it's time for us to talk about the Time Variance Authority, aka the TVA. Now, as we're looking at the TVA, one of the things to go ahead and point out is that they didn't make an appearance in Marvel Comics until 1986, and they appeared in a Thor comic at this point. Even more so, they sent a totally different hero, and I think his name was either Peace Justice or Justice Peace. I'll make sure to correct for that here. But this hero of the timeline, I guess you could say, was at odds with Thor at first, but they ended up teaming up to correct for what was taking place at this point in the story. A villain was looking to set off a bomb and kill several hundreds of people, and this would infringe upon the timeline on a cataclysmic level. So hence where the TVA makes interference to correct for what takes place at this point. So as we can see, the TVA somewhat still lives up to that standard of what takes place in Marvel Comics, the same as what they do in the MCU. Keep order of the timeline. Now, to be more specific, the TVA in the earlier comics only intervened when something cataclysmic was taking place. Now, they don't have many appearances throughout Marvel Comics, which begs the question, with all that we've seen take place, Thanos getting his hands on the gauntlet and snapping several people in the universe out of existence, him contending with celestial beings, where was the TVA to stop Thanos? Where was the TVA to stop Kang the Conqueror? Spoiler alert. Where was the TVA in several different instances throughout Marvel's history to help correct for cataclysmic things that were taking place? Now, that's mainly because they weren't being used. They were kind of like plot armor tools. An example to connect with is like that of the Tribunal. The Living Tribunal, whenever there is a magical threat that comes up that would cause damage or injury to an entirety of a universe, or the multiverse at that is when the Living Tribunal comes in to intervene in those instances. Otherwise, they don't come to intervene. And again, their main responsibility is to that of magical threats, which is also why they don't intervene in every instance. So that's the case with the TVA. The TVA, they do not intervene unless it is a cataclysmic event. Now, as time goes on, there is a confliction between what's known as time twisters versus time keepers. So, with the time twisters, they were ones that were trying to manipulate the timeline for their own personal gains, for evil intent, to put it simply. But then that story ended up getting twisted to where now we had the time keepers. The time keepers, they were ones that, of course, also wanted to keep the order of the timeline as we see, as how they're portrayed in the MCU as well. They want to keep order of the timeline. But particularly, at least the story that they're sticking with Marvel Comics, is they're doing it only to ensure that they exist. So anything that happens in the timeline that would keep them from existing, that's when they will have the TVA intervene. Now, that makes the timeline, or the way that Marvel Comics is flowing, seem to make a little more sense at this point, only because it seems that not a lot of things could cause them to not exist. So that's where they don't need to intervene as much as they otherwise would in the past. That's at least my perspective and what I take away from the way that Marvel has went about continuing with the timekeepers and the use of the TVA. Now, for those of you that don't already understand, variants are different versions of the same character at either different points in the timeline, or there being different outcomes to the way that their lives played out. So here's one example. What if Captain America never took the serum, and what would his story have been like? That would be a different branch. What if Loki had died earlier versus him dying later? Those are some things that they play on. We even see where the question becomes, because the lady Loki that we get, she was taken by the TVA when she was simply a child. So there was no specific crime that she committed. However, they hint to she was simply taken in because she was a girl, not because of any other reason. So those questions come up throughout the series of who was taken and why were they taken and why was their timeline reset? What was the mistake that they made that interfered with the timeline? All of those questions get asked constantly throughout the series. So, when we're talking again about the TVA in correlation to Marvel Comics, they lived up to that standard in making sure to keep with the timeline. Now, this is not to say they're keeping with the multiverse. That's one thing to make clear. The MCU's TVA is strictly specifically focused on the main timeline and keeping that continuity the same. If anything causes a branch, they will intervene to keep that branch from taking place by resetting that portion of the timeline. The reason that they are doing that, as they will articulate in the show, is because a war took place back in the day when the first cataclysmic branch took place. Several multiverses were being established, but there was a great war. So to fix for that, all the timelines were reconstructed down to just one consistent timeline. Hence, the TVA keeps that timeline consistent. Now, when we're talking about the show, that makes sense. That makes following along a lot easier for us versus what we get when Marvel Comics and stuff, they just throw stuff out there and now it's up to them to correct for their mistakes, which is why they have teams like the TVA, which is why they have the Living Tribunal and other entities at that level who can just snap their fingers and fix stuff back to normal. That's why we have that plot armor. Alright, now, let us shift gears. We're going to be shifting to talking about He Who Remains, or in this case, Kang the Conqueror? Alright, let's get into discussing He Who Remains. Now, there's not a lot to be said about him. One of the main things to just go ahead and point out is he's just another member of the TVA. He Who Remains is actually, when we're talking about Marvel Comics, he is the oldest living member of the Time Variance Authority. Just basically meaning he's been around a really long time. Hence why he was given that position or that seat as being over the TVA in the first place. That's why he was given that position. Now, here's what's significant about him, opposite to what we get in the MCU, is that he created the Timekeepers. Now, again, he has his part in the Time Twisters, which is believed to be where they would change from Time Twisters to Timekeepers, but he is the one that created them to ensure the consistency of the timeline. So that is the purpose that he serves. He's really just a very old person who has been a part of this project for a very long time. However, here's where things change. When we're looking at the MCU, they instead utilize Kang the Conqueror as one that did this. Now, to go ahead and touch on these two, to clarify Kang the Conqueror, comic book standpoint, he is one that seeks to conquer in several different standpoints within the Marvel timeline, or even more so several different universes, particularly which is the goal of them here in the MCU. But what we see in Marvel Comics is he was even around at the time when Apocalypse first appeared in Egypt in the early days, in those early years of the timeline. He was there ruling over Egypt at that time. He has come back in time to contend with the Avengers, with the Fantastic Four, and several other heroes that we know and love. But he has always been a running threat. Even more so, we find out in the future that he continues to pursue conquering in those times. Now, other things to keep in mind as well is it is determined that his name is, if I'm correct, it's Nathaniel Richards, thus revealing that he is a descendant of Reed Richards, who is considerably one of, if not the smartest character in all of Marvel Comics. Arguably, that's Iron Man, Dr. Doom, and his daughter Valeria, I believe is her name. She's also believed to be smarter than her father. But again, that just shows that that's in the blood. So he comes into the storyline as well. Nathaniel Richards taking over the role as Iron Man later at some point in Marvel Comics as well. So Kang the Conqueror has multiple positions and multiple roles throughout Marvel Comics. Now, when we're looking at him from the standpoint of the MCU, they have thus used him to speak to that war that took place with the multiple timelines back in the past was due to the Kangs from all of those universes going to war. They seem to have played on where they had once came together to be able to advance together. There were versions of themselves that wanted to supersede themselves. So they began to conquer each other's universes and go to war. This is where we have this version of Kang, He Who Remains, who decides, no, we don't need to have this war continue to take place. I'm going to take control of the timeline. And even more so, be ahead of everything that can take place within the timeline. So as we see in the MCU, spoiler alert, as Loki and Sylvie were able to approach him, he already knew everything that they were going to say and every move that they were going to make. I almost forgot, because they used this here in this very episode, in the very last episode, is that he's highly skilled with technology. He had a technology that allowed him to go ahead and already be set at a point in time to get out of the way of any attacks that Sylvie or Loki could have done to him. He already knew what was going to happen. Now, in Marvel Comics, he operates in similar light, however, destructively. He comes with several different types of guns, armor, and other such things to conquer different universes. His technology is so advanced, it allowed for him at one point, because the Avengers had to call on him, it allowed for him to beat Thanos. That's how advanced his technology is. So he is someone to be feared. Now, the MCU ends in this version of Kang dying, but revealing that now that the multiverse has begun to take place, we're going to get multiple versions of Kang throughout the Marvel Universe. And that's a dangerous thing to expect. He's going to be a threat to be reckoned with as we see this series progress. Alright everybody, it's time for the fun part, where we get to talk about these hidden messages that you can find in the series of Loki, as well as that Christian perspective. Let's get into this thing. So, some of the things like I was already kind of hinting at earlier on, where we see in the beginning, at least with the character of Loki throughout the MCU, we see that his character is troubled in making the right decisions, and what plays a part in that is the parents or the father figure Odin, and the way that that plays out for him. Now, with that being said, it's almost as to take the responsibility off Loki to do good and putting all of that on Odin for not having raised him in a different fashion because of who he is and what he was, to ensure that he would end up being good. So a lot of blame can go that way, but at the same time, the MCU does a great job of making it clear that that evilness that is demonstrated in Loki was already making itself evident even before the truth was revealed. He had already planned to betray Odin before he even knew that there was a secret being kept against him. He just always felt different. And then he learned the truth. So that there's a balance of, father needs to take responsibility, absolutely, but there's some responsibility on Loki in that. But I also want to definitely highlight the way that the MCU goes from him just being evil in a couple of movies to him being almost like an anti-hero, where I'm doing good things, although I still have these evil, mischievous thoughts and plans. Again, like I said, he's died about 2 and 3 times, deceiving the good and the bad into thinking that he was dead when he actually wasn't. And so that ended up resulting, once we got to Infinity War, where he actually allows for himself to die while going against Thanos to try and help and make sure Thanos, 1, wouldn't get another one of the Infinity Stones, and 2, he wouldn't end up killing Thor in this instance. But something, at least from my perspective, we see that for Loki, at that point, this was him doing good things, not him being good in essence. Him and his character being good, because as we see with the story of Loki in the on Disney Plus, what's happened there is him fulfilling his role according to He Who Remains and the TVA, ensuring that he does this thing. So it's about the things that he does, not who he is in that process. But what we get with the TV series of Loki is we get to see Loki develop time over time into developing that character. The TVA, as they have already taken him in, demonstrate high level of concern with him being loose or him being in their custody because of, as we stated before, the rogue Loki that is going around, Sylvie. And with that, they're doing all of this high monitoring, but there is the character of Mobius, who is looking at him as one that he could possibly give a chance to make a difference to. Even more so, offering him a position with the TVA. As I pointed out earlier, to go ahead and make things clear for Loki that everything is under the expectations of the timekeepers, he shows him what his life was supposed to be like. And this impacts Loki in the ways of, 1, wondering what his purpose is, and 2, wanting to know why no one truly had free will. He wanted these questions answered. That's something that he wrestled with. But in this instance, you really just get to see Loki, to some extent, operate as someone moving to some extent into free will, because now his actual character is being shaped. The essence of who he is being shaped. as he goes through these trials and tribulations with the TVA, as he goes to meet with, contend with, and at the end of the day, fight alongside Sylvie, the other version of Loki, the character of himself grows as he, one, learns more about what it means to be a part of the timeline, how these things can affect people where they don't have free will, and his pursuit of free will, but in the right way. I think they did another powerful thing where they had him at a certain point in his past where he'd done something mischievous, something simple. But in him doing that, this prompted for him to genuinely be apologetic, admit to the nature of to who he is, but also giving a level of repentance in this moment, and then showing that he has now changed. So these are significant details about the show that takes place that I think really speaks to the development of the character of Loki, which gives it a positive in the area of Christianity, because like I said, that repentance, even though you were born into an evil household, even though you were raised by people that didn't raise you right, the opportunity to change your character, to change the flow of your life, is always being present. So I think that is extremely powerful, and I'm gonna get into something a bit deeper there here in a moment. But another thing to go ahead and hit on as well that I think is extremely important is the way that the show ended. Oh, it was such a powerful ending, because what happens is Loki and Sylvie, they end up getting to the end of time. I don't want to give all the spoilers, but they end up getting to the end of time, and in them getting to the end of time, they were able to meet with Kang and to speak with him, and he revealed, I was in control of everything. I know everything you're going to say, everything that you're going to do. I'm already aware of all of it. And he reveals everything that took place with the timeline. But because his attention was distracted, which is believed to be, this is when Scarlet Witch began to read the book to tap into that power of her hex magic. As she tapped more into that, she caused a branch of the timeline. Now, Kang was not prepared for that. With Kang not being prepared for that, someone else either needs to step up to correct for the timeline, or he needs to go ahead and die, because now all these other versions of Kang are about to resurrect or come up in this moment. So he gives Loki and Sylvie an opportunity to make a decision. Okay, so this allows for us to kind of go into the depth of the character of Sylvie. As I mentioned before, she did nothing specifically against the timeline other than existing. So in her having been taken in by the TVA, she was able to get away from them and hide from them and come up with a plan to be able to get to this point where she can get her revenge against Kang for all that he's done against the multiple versions of Loki, but even more so, destroying her life as he did. And so this now puts both Loki and Sylvie in this position of, do we seek revenge, or do we do what's right to ensure that what caused the war in the first place against the multiple time streams doesn't happen? We take that leadership role. So there's no winning for losing in this situation. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that. There's no winning for losing in this situation. And so where Loki's character has grown, Loki is like, we need to take responsibility for how far we've come and whatever parts we may have played in this. Where Sylvie's as, no, I'm going to get my revenge, and that's what needs to be sought here. Now here's the argument that takes place, right? Because what's also revealed is a relationship between Sylvie and Loki. They grow closer together. They want a relationship. They want to be together. Now I want to go deeper into that later as far as from a Christian perspective, but what we see here is there's a difference between self-love and being selfish because of this relationship. You only love yourself. The only person Loki in the entire series of the MCU was able to fall in love with was himself. Oh my goodness, that's the running joke there. But here's what we don't realize, that there's a message there about whether or not you have self-love, which is what Loki was getting to. He's like, I want to get to a place where I love myself. Where Sylvie was being selfish, I am looking to get what I want out of this. No matter who I come into contact with, I'm going to fulfill this. And if you're with me, that's great. If you're not, you're going down. That's the mindset of Sylvie at the end of the day. So that them illustrating that through these two characters was extremely powerful. And as we know, the selfishness won out in the end. But here's the crazy thing. Because where it is selfish, we see what corruptible things he's done to make, that Kang has done to make these things happen. But at the same time, we see on the other side where it's just completely selfish. You did it for yourself. You don't care what the outcome's going to be, because if you cared about how the timeline went and how people have been impacted by this, you should be also caring about how people are going to be impacted after this as well. That shows a lack of maturity, at least from my perspective, on the character of Sylvie. So let's get more into the Christian perspective here, because here's something that I think is extremely crucial. One of which, since we're already talking about their relationship, let's go on into it. With them demonstrating this relationship between Loki and Sylvie, being that they're the same person, something's happening here. Somewhat of a message, that non-binary perspective of sexuality that's highly being spoken to today, and seeing as how you can switch between genders in that, that's something that's being demonstrated here. And there are those that go to extremes of saying, they're animals, and we get alligator Loki, and that's something that is concerning if that is the case. But what I would say in that is they are actually capitalizing on the not only just timeline impact, where depending on how that timeline goes, this is how you're going to end up being who you are. What I think they're actually doing is speaking to the depth of the character of Loki as far as the Norse mythology goes, because Loki knows how to change between genders, between animals, and other such things of that nature. So I think that's more so of what they were getting at with being able to use that, and them having that relationship is the way that he plays on that according to Norse mythology. Prayerfully not to speak to this non-binary or story of any gender changing or anything like that. I strongly believe or pray that that's not the case. It's something to watch out for, but I pray that that's not the case. So that leads me to the bigger picture here, where as we were seeing with Odin influencing Loki's life, and then the Timekeepers actually, He Who Remains and the TVA being the one to influence Loki's life. That leads to where there are people that have a concern with God being in control of their life. To one, where they don't want a relationship with God, or two, they learn that God is in control of all things, but bad things have happened to them, so then they blame God. So that's what we're getting here with this series, is addressing that, not in the best ways, but they're addressing that. So as Loki learns, my purpose was not my own. This was the influence of somebody else, even to the words that I say, me playing this part. That's evil. That takes away free will. That's not free will. But those that follow Christ know that God is one that allows for you to have free will to make the choices that you want to make. But he doesn't free you of the consequences of the choices that you make. So how then does this work if that is the case? So the way that I've always understood this, one, I'm going to give an illustration. Two, I'm going to give scripture. For the illustration, it's as though you are going on a path, and then there's the fork in the road. The up is the right direction, or the good decision, and the down is the bad decision. Sometimes we make the wrong decision, whether we know it or not, and that leads to us going down. We go to another fork in the road, and we continue to make downward bad decisions. But there's always still an opportunity to make a right one, which will lead to you going up. And the most that God does that plays a part of your free will is he puts that fork in the road. Hey, you have a decision to make here. What's your decision going to be? You have a decision to make here. What's your decision going to be? You have a decision to make here. What's your decision going to be? You're presented with that in almost every instance of your life. And it's up to you to make the best call for you to move forward. And even if that forward means going downward, the opportunity to go upward, which I would tie to the grace and mercy of God, those opportunities will always be laid before you. Now, with that being said, to tie that back to scripture, right? In the story of Cain and Abel, just to clarify, in the Garden of Eden, the snake was present to influence Eve into eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, hence leading to Adam eating of it and then them getting kicked out of the garden. With Cain and Abel, as Cain was angry with the way that things were going about as far as who was making better sacrifices, where we see that to be Abel, Cain wasn't. God comes in this moment to speak to Cain. There's no serpent, there's no devil there to speak into the heart or mind of Cain. It's just Cain. And what God reveals to Cain is you just need to do better. You need to make better decisions and give your best in everything that you do. Because why? Because sin knocks at the door. So you are being presented with an opportunity to make a sinful or wrong or self-destructive decision. You have to choose wisely even in that. God caught him at the fork in the road and showed him, son, there is a fork in the road here. Make the best decision. This is the best decision. And God let him make the decision. God didn't shift him in any way, shape, or form when it comes to that decision. And I think that's extremely significant when we're talking about God's influence on our lives. God takes away our free will. He doesn't. He doesn't. He gives you conscience so that you can honestly, one, think through before you do. And even if you do, you get convicted so that you learn not to continue to do what you do. And then the Bible speaks of two other things. That is where if you continue to make bad decision after bad decision, even though you've been presented with an opportunity to change, it's been revealed to you that what you're doing is wrong, dangerous, or to your detriment or other people's detriment, and you continue to choose that, he will sear your conscience with a hot iron, meaning you'll no longer feel conviction for what it is that you're doing. You will think that the wrong that you are doing isn't wrong, even more so, maybe even right. But that's because he's given you away to your own fleshly devices. Without there being a devil's influence, without there being a God's influence. This is what you want to do. You go and do that. You still get the consequences, but you go and do that. And along the way, that's where you find people blaming God. Even more so when we're looking at the instance in Egypt, when the Pharaoh when Pharaoh, would not allow for the children of Israel to leave Egypt. It was because God hardened his heart. Now, here's where there's a confliction here. People think that God's influencing free will. God's not influencing free will. This is reflected of searing that conscience with a hot iron. He sees that there is a darkness in Pharaoh, that Pharaoh wants to do wrong against the Israelites. So he solidifies him in that mindset. This is what you really feel like. Go ahead, operate in what you really feel and see what happens. That's what was happening to Pharaoh with God's intervention. But God was not saying, I'm going to make Pharaoh evil. These were the decisions of Pharaoh and resulting in the consequences as to what we see in Scripture for what took place to him, to his firstborn, and to the rest of the Egyptians following that encounter. So I want to encourage you guys, and in watching this, these are some of the things to watch out for. These are some of the things that could speak positively or speak negatively, depending on who's watching and what you're watching for. But this is some of the cues I just wanted to point out with you guys, and I pray that this was a blessing for you as we are looking at the series of Loki, which you can find on Disney Plus, and it's only 6 episodes. So if you decide to watch it, keep your eyes and ears open. Be prayerful, and I hope you enjoy. So God bless. Peace.